Welcome to this USurfaceMesh preview video for version 1.3. As you can see, I'm in Unreal Engine 5, so I now have the plugin available in this version as well. So the few features I'm going to show you today, the first one being before in previous versions we used to be able to apply the mesh to the landscape. Well, now we can apply it to the paint layers as well. So with this USurfaceMesh grid here, I've already set it up so that in the landscape section, we link it to the landscape, and it's told to turn on Create Mesh, and it's auto render is turned on as well, so it auto renders what I've set up inside of the render textures section, which in here vertex red color is being set using the surface angle of the surface. So that's what makes it red on the slopes, and that again that's set up under the render surface angle options here. So we select everything that's 0, have a fall off round to 60 degrees, and then because we've got invert surface angle, it selects everything that is on a slope. So in the landscape section, we are telling the red vertex colors to render their white colors to layer 3, which in this case on the landscape, layer 3 is set as the rock. So now what we can do is go to at the top we make sure sculpt landscape is turned on and paint landscape is turned on. So without the mesh, it just looks like that on the landscape. And then if we now choose apply to landscape, it sculpts the landscape to match the mesh, and it also paints the landscape layers at the same time. So now we have an immediate effect on the landscape. And of course you can set it up so that different vertex colors can be painted with different surface information, and then that surface, those vertex colors can then be used to paint different layers on the landscape all at the same time. So moving on, the next one is with this version 1.3 of USurfaceMesh, you can now warp the mesh using a spline. So before, all we could do is create a rectangular grid panel, whereas now if we enable use spline, we can now drag out change the live update interval time to be faster so that it becomes more responsive. But you can now warp the mesh using the spline. It's just a case of create mesh, and by default the values are set to 5, 5 and 5 for left, right, bottom and top, which if we go to preview mode again, we can see that's the bottom and that's the top. So if we increase the density vertically, then now it becomes smoother. So here I've already created a predefined closed loop as well, which you close the loop using the spline section. Turn on closed loop here. If the mesh doesn't update with the closed loop, then just choose Update Mesh. So with this one, again, we can link it to the landscape. This time we're only actually going to enable Sculpt Landscape, not Paint Landscape. So now we can actually choose Apply to Landscape. And at the moment the landscape has been sculpted both up and down. So once you have that complete, the reason that you get the jagged edges on the mesh, on the landscape, is because of the density of the landscape. They're pushed up or down to match where the mesh is, and obviously beyond that there is no mesh data anyway, so we don't warp any of that. But you can always either go around with the manual sculpt tool and smooth the landscape off yourself, or you can just add another USurfaceMesh grid, recapture this entire area, and then in the capture section you just increase the capture smoothing value to a higher value. I usually use something like 3, and then just relink it to the landscape and then reapply. Hit apply to landscape with the sculpt landscape turned on as well, and that should then smooth it out for you. And of course with the spline, you're free to make whatever shape you want. Just remember that the landscape is up and down, so it can't do loops. But it would be very hard to actually make a track that was as smooth as this if you, well, it would just be impossible using the sculpting tools. You'd be there forever trying to make that. Whereas at least with USurfaceMesh, makes it nice and easy to use. So with this spline still in place, what you can also do now is use the spline to actually make a road. So this is a surface mesh that actually elevates itself above where the landscape currently is. So to do that, we can first of all narrow the track on the left and the right, and then we can choose to raise the landscape. So we set a max height of 30 centimeters. And then we go down to the height section. So now we can use the use vertical height curve. And then in here we can go to the USurfaceMesh content folder, go to curves, so we go to height curves and then use the road 1 curve. And then we can increase the density. So as it is, that has now created a surface that warps itself up and then across using the curve values. These curve values. And you're free to specify how high you want that. And the edge can be pushed underneath the landscape as well with an offset. So we can go shift before removing polygons. That forces the edge polygons underneath the landscape. And this is a perfect match as well. So if you actually go underneath the mesh, it will, in the center, it will be 20 centimeters above the landscape. And then all you have to do with that one is choose to stamp the mesh, give it an appropriate name, choose a path to save it to. This warning is just warning us that because we've used a curve, then it might not be able to recreate the mesh once it's stamped, if that curve was changed. So now this has been stamped. That means that the USurfaceMesh has been changed for the actual static mesh, which has then been saved inside of whatever folder you told it to. So if we go into that, static mesh, then this is the mesh that was produced. So now we can also place a different material on the static mesh, and I've just got one from Quixel Bridge. So if we apply that onto that, I've just increased the tiling vertically, then it now looks better, more like a road. So because we use the same spline, then it matches the landscape perfectly. So moving on with the idea of the spline, then what I've done here is I've dragged out another grid, and then one of the new features of USurfaceMesh version 1.3 is that we can now, well, in previous versions you could use world aligned textures, whereas now there's an improved version of that. And so it matches the world aligned texture nodes used inside of the materials. So you can actually get the mesh to warp and match the material that is applied to it. So it uses world aligned, the texture and the mesh both have the same scale or world size. And here I've loaded in the texture that contains the height map of the material, chosen the channel that it's on. And so what this does is it makes it so that the mesh, as you can see, the mesh is now displaced and actually matches the material. If we decrease the complexity, make it run a little bit faster. But under here, we've got the spline points. So if we move these around, then we can get the mesh to warp and actually show where these are going to be placed. And of course, if you go into the landscape sculpt, then we can also sculpt. We can also sculpt areas in here. And then we can tell it to project. So it'll project down onto the floor. And then tell it to shift down a certain number of centimeters. And then if we build it with a high enough complexity again, which will end up with millions of polygons, so if we were to stamp this onto the surface, then what this also means is that we can actually use this to displace or use it for the character, so he can actually truly walk on the stones that are there rather than actually his feet sliding through them. At the moment it uses complex collision, which is per polygon collision, as the simple collision. You may want to come up with some way of using the Unreal plugin, modeling plugin, to create a simplified mesh. But there are other things that we can do as well. So I'll show you another feature that it has. If we do go and create that mesh, so again we choose the path where we want to stamp it into. And at the moment it's got 1.28 million polygons. So it's a very complex mesh, as you can see. If we choose stamp mesh, again that converts it to an actual static mesh. So there is the static mesh that was created. And in the world, this has now been placed into the landscape. So the new feature that we have is a new actor called USurfaceMeshEdit. But before we do this, what I'll use is the Unreal modeling plugin. And what I'd like to do here, so I'd like to remesh the static mesh here. So if we choose remesh, and then we can set a target triangle count. So for this, we set it to 500,000. Then we'll choose accept. And then we can also choose to simplify the mesh with a target percentage of 50%. So this combines nearby vertices together to reduce the polygon count where it doesn't curve, where it's flat. So that now has 250,000. See if we can reduce it some more. So once we're happy with the amount that it has, should we go to the static mesh, we can see that this now contains 104,000 triangles. So the USurfaceMeshEdit actor, if we drag one of them into the scene, allows us to select the static mesh that we want to edit, and it checks the surface for the polygons to see if they intersect with the landscape. So we'll use remove mode will be surface check. We'll have a minimum removal distance of 4 centimeters. So make sure there's a gap between the gap that's underneath has to be at 4 centimeters or more, which this was shifted down 8 centimeters at its deepest. So anyway, we'll choose remove polygons, see what gets removed. So at the moment only those on the edge got removed. So if we decrease the removal distance, it keeps going in. Change it to 1. So all those on the edge are getting removed. So at 0.5, some of the ones in the center are getting removed now. It allows the ones that are very, very close to the surface to remain, which are the ones that displace up, and they're the ones underneath. Because they're not visible, they're removed. And then once you're happy with that, you just choose Save Static Mesh. That then saves that mesh as a new mesh. So here we have the new mesh with all the polygons removed. And if we look at this, this now has 95,000 polygons instead of, I think it was 105,000, 104,000. So of course you can reduce the number of polygons down as much as you need to. But now with an actual character on the surface, we can see that the feet actually displace correctly. So thank you for joining me for this preview video. USurfaceMesh version 1.3 will be released very soon. Have a nice day.